Have you ever had a civil discussion with someone you disagreed with? If you have, what did you learn? Here on the Moderate Review, we try to have these kinds of discussions. So, let's talk. On this episode of the Moderate Review, I am joined by fellow podcaster Alan Holmes, host of Hidden Lynchings and Why Pay. On this episode, we have a discussion on a case for slave reparations. So, let's talk.
Unpopular opinion that I think an unpopular opinion that I have, especially here in Atlanta, is that I want the city population to go to about 1.5 million. Currently, it's a little bit over 550,000 residents, but I want to see it to go to 1 million. And a lot
Okay.
of residents in the city of Atlanta don't want the city to get that big.
Okay. And why is that?
Because when I lived in DC, so I've been in Atlanta for 8 years, but prior to living here in Atlanta, I lived in DC, and I really enjoyed the density. I enjoyed the fact that, the city of DC has over 1 million residents. The transit, as far as the train or the bus, take you a lot of different places, and I just like the energy of a big city. So that's why I hope that Atlanta's population inside the city limits eventually gets to 1 million, because there's between 4 and 6 million people that live in the Atlanta metro area, but only 550,000 of them actually live in the city limits.
Okay.
So I think the city has a lot of room to grow.
Okay. Okay. I could definitely understand where you're coming from because I lived in the DC area for a bit, and I understand the energy that comes from it. And so, like, were you living in DC, or like kind of like Maryland or Northern Virginia?
Actually, I lived there for 2 years. So the first year I was living in the city of DC. So I lived over in LaJoy Park, which is near Howard University in Northwest Atlanta. But then my last year there, I actually lived in the suburbs of Maryland in Montgomery County. So I was in Germantown, Maryland.
Okay. Okay. All right. Cool. Cool. All right. Thank you for that. So, as we start our interview, here's this question: Why pay?
Why pay? Listen, that's a good question, Jack. And I have some good data points to bring up as to why I believe reparations needs to be paid to Black Americans, and a lot of it just goes to the shocking wealth gap statistics that exist. So I'm gonna go over a few points that are pretty impactful. The average white family wealth currently is 10 times that of the wealth of Black families. When you look at the labor regarding slavery and the amount of cost of slave labor and what it created, that's another reason. Slaves created a lot of the wealth in America, built a lot of the infrastructure and the railroads, and helped to spearhead or launch the cotton production industry, which created so much wealth. So that is free labor. So in 1860, $3 billion were assigned to the value of enslaved Black Americans. So that was the value of the number of slaves that existed in America. In 1861, the value of those slaves placed on the cotton they produced was about $250 million. So you see the numbers are staggering in regards to the cost of slaves and what they produced for nothing.
Mm-hmm.
And thirdly, I think you have to look at beyond slavery. You have to look at other statistics, such as the fact that a white family's median wealth is about 171,000. This data is coming from the Survey of Consumer Finances in 2016. So the average white family's median wealth is 171,000. The average Black family's median wealth is about $17,600. And so you look at other statistics that are connected to housing. Black neighborhoods were undervalued by about $45,000 per home on average, which comes to about $156 billion in lost value. And lastly, I would say you have to look at the fact that people say, well, go to college, get graduate degree, get a master's degree. This will close the gaps, right? If you look at the Survey on Income and Programming, the SIPP study, they found that white Americans with less than a high school diploma have a larger net worth at $82,968 than do Black Americans with a college degree at $70,219. So you see that it doesn't really matter what we do. The wealth gap is so great that it doesn't really decrease to the extent that it should. So I would say those are some statistics that hammer home the point of why reparations is needed so that we can aggressively close this gap.
And I guess more of my questions, I guess more in regards to that. So, did they kind of state maybe why there's such a large wage gap? Because I'm in this kind of the same boat. Like if everybody, or words, if I have a bachelor's degree and you have a bachelor's degree and we're in the same field, then by all means, yeah, they should. We should be in theory being paid the same, but like
Yeah.
with slight variance. But like how you're describing it, that's really not the case. Did they kind of explain why that's the case?
What? So, why the gap? Is it? Is this such as that?
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
so from what I've studied, the gap exists because a lot of wealth, or a certain percentage of wealth that many individuals have, is passed down through inheritances and bequests. And so if you have a race of people or a segment of people who have no wealth, that's why the gap continues to exist regardless of income. Because of what a lot of people can get confused is they focus on income when what I'm arguing is that we need to focus on the lack of wealth.
Mm,
So the reason that the gap exists is starting with slavery, slaves not being able to get the 40 acres and a mule, other government practices such as redlining and racial covenants that didn't even allow Black people who were successful to purchase homes, which is the main driver of wealth in our country, real estate. They weren't able to acquire homes, even the ones who had money, to then pass these homes down.
mm,
So the gap exists because of that, regardless of how successful someone is currently right now. Where they may go to the same university you did, Jack, and may get a grad degree at the same school I did and be hardworking, responsible people, but they still have very little wealth. And I
mm.
mean, I would argue that that's the reason that the gap exists, is because it would take a monumental policy such as reparations to close it. That's why I mean,
Mm.
I there's really no way that I think you can adequately close it without some sort of government redress.
Okay. And just more of a question. Could you explain what land coveting and redlining is, just to our viewers?
A racial covenant.
Yeah, racial. Yeah.
So what a racial covenant says is that in before around the mid 40s, they were outlawed due to supreme legal lawsuits and things like that. The government kind of outlawed them, but a racial covenant said that if you had that in your deed, your property deed, that meant that you could not sell your home to an African American. And
Hmm.
this was almost, I mean, I would argue it was almost more detrimental than redlining, because redlining said that, if you live in a certain area, it's going to be flagged as hazardous. You're not going to be able to
Hmm.
get bank loans. But racial covenant said that even if you were a Black person in 1933 who was still able to be successful despite the racism, and you were able to get a loan in a white neighborhood to buy a house that now might be worth $1 million, you you couldn't buy the house. So since you couldn't buy the house, you never were able to live in it, pass it
Hmm.
down,
Hmm.
sell it for a ton of money. So your family never got that money. You couldn't pass it down. So I think that that's the definition of a racial covenant, and that was very it was done in most every city. In one of our episodes on the reparations podcast, we found that the Capitol Hill neighborhood in Seattle, the neighbors banded together and went door to door and got 900 and over 980 homeowners to change their covenants in their deeds to not sell them to black people, because at that time you were seeing a prosperous black community that was getting to be at the point of
Mm,
being able to purchase homes in those neighborhoods.
mm,
So 984 homeowners revised their deeds to exclude black people from being able to purchase the homes. And if you look at Capitol Hill neighborhood in Seattle now, it's a highly desirable in-town community where you can imagine the homes are worth obscene amounts. But the people
mm,
who purchased the homes in the 40s, had they kept them, that's a lot of wealth passed down. So yeah,
mm.
that's kind of a little
Okay.
bit about that.
Does this exist today, and like how would we police it?
It does not exist today. Once it was outlawed by I can't recall currently right now, but it was, the issue went all the way to the Supreme Court, because you can imagine people
Mm,
eventually were angry about it, people who were trying to get houses, so there were lawsuits and lawsuits filed all over the country, and then eventually it made its way to the Supreme Court. But currently that does not happen. But I mean, thankfully it doesn't happen anymore. But I mean, if you really look at it, there are so few black people who can afford to live in certain communities that, I mean, it doesn't even matter. They're not going to be there anyway. I
mm,
mean, and it's just simply not to say that we're not capable of
yeah.
living in. It's just the wealth gap. We own African Americans control 3% of the wealth in this country, which means it's highly unlikely that you're going to see them in the most prosperous communities anywhere.
Okay.
So but yeah, it's technically illegal currently for that to happen on a deed.
And then, I guess as we're continuing on, I guess more my question, you talked about how this reparations should be made or only be made at a government level. And I guess some of the other questions I have is like, who would pay? How would you envision, or how have you researched how would this happen?
How would this happen? So I think initially, I guess, would you want to talk more about qualifications too? About who
Yes.
might?
Yes, that
Okay,
too.
cool.
Yeah.
So I think my idea, which is based on a lot of the research of Duke professor Sandy Darity, who's delved into this issue quite extensively. It would come down to two qualifications. You would have to demonstrate that you have at least one enslaved ancestor in the United States, that you're descended from at least one enslaved ancestor. And number two, you must have self-described as black for at least 10 years prior to the onset of a program. So I think that the second criteria is in place to I guess address the issues that you would even imagine coming up, where somebody who's not black will say, well, look, I did ancestry.com and I have, 6% black in my family, or 2%, or I have something, right?
Hmm.
But let's imagine that this person didn't self-identify as black at all on the census, because for all intents and purposes at that time, they didn't think it was worthwhile. And so now when reparations
Mm,
come, they want to do that. So those people wouldn't be able to receive it. But again, the reason that the enslaved ancestor is critical and who gets this is because this is a legal claim against the federal government, Jack. And so I'm
mm,
as much as adamant as I am that this debt be paid. I also, interestingly enough, don't think that the United States federal government should be responsible for paying individuals who it did not harm. So if you look at the things that I just discussed initially, which was
hmm.
slavery, which was black codes, which was Jim Crow, which was redlining and racial covenants, a majority of the most painful parts of all of that, as well as black, World War II veterans not being able to utilize New Deal housing or education programs, is that happened to primarily black people who had descended from slaves. Because if you look at immigration, from the end of slavery to the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, most of the black American black people in the country descended from slaves. Immigration
Hmm.
picked up in the 80s, of course, and have exploded. So you
Hmm.
have a lot of black immigrants here, which again, I don't have an issue with them. We're all united, but this is a legal claim, right? And so
Hmm.
the United States doesn't owe money to someone who is Jamaican who immigrated here. They knew what they were getting into, just as Nigerians, just as Kenyans.
Hmm.
Ju- They, they they knew about America's history of racism, about certain things that have happened in our history. Not that it's all bad, but they voluntarily came here, right?
Hmm.
We involuntarily came here. We were forced here. So there's a clear distinction that we must make. And
Hmm.
also, I would say someone who's Jamaican, someone who is Kenyan, someone who is Nigerian, they actually deserve reparations. But my only point is that they must make that claim with the colonial powers that controlled the country that they are from. So
Hmm.
Haitian Americans have most certainly have a reparations claim that they
Oh
need
yeah.
to take up with the French government. So you see how it goes.
Yeah.
It's just that you must make your claim with the country that harmed your native country. Because the U.S.
Hmm.
government is not responsible for that. And so I am adamant about those two being qualifications. And now, what I would say about the price tag, 11 to 14 trillion. That's
Okay.
what I would estimate, because if you look at the present day value of the 400,000 acres that Union General Sherman initially allocated to former slaves along the coast of South Carolina to Florida, that present day value is $6 trillion. That obviously never had. That's 40 acres and a mule.
Mm.
So those 40 acres and a mule was never given out because President Andrew Jackson ended that plan. So just that alone is 6 trillion. Combined with everything I was telling you about the lost wages through redlining, black codes, all of that, that's how you get to 11 to 14 trillion. And that would come out to 250,000 to each black American. But my preference is that it would go to black American descendants of slaves. And understand that this doesn't have to be a lump sum, because that's
Hmm.
what's been crazy, right? You're
Hmm.
you're 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 an economics guy. You understand numbers. The government paying 11 to 14 trillion at one time is not going to ever
Yeah.
happen.
Yeah. Good luck.
Now, you cannot. I don't personally care how it's stretched out and paid. It could follow a similar model to how people who win a lottery agree or ask that their winnings are paid out. Some of it is a lump sum. Some of it is annually for 15 years. Is whatever. That that's fine if it would need to be stretched out. And actually, Jack, I'm also open to the private sector stepping up. Companies that benefited or
Mm.
were created through slavery, or some companies whose wealth was generated through the slave trade, can always chip in, right? It's called a
Hmm.
public-private partnership. Maybe we should think of it that way, to say, well, the federal government should pay it all, but they're not the only ones who benefited from slavery or instituted policies. Some of these companies benefited. So if the private sector put up 6 trillion or 7 trillion, the federal government put up 7 trillion. Great, that's less money from the taxpayers. But at some
Hmm.
point, this has to be paid, because if you didn't know, and I've learned a lot of this through research, Brooks Brothers, the famous clothing company, right?
Hmm.
They benefited greatly from slavery. So Brooks Brothers actually provided the attire that slave owners and the slaves dressed themselves in when they went to the auction to trade humans.
Hmm.
That's how Brooks Brothers got its reputation, because this, I mean,
Hmm.
I don't know if Brooks Brothers is popular where you are in Utah. It probably is nationwide. But what I've learned in the South is that Brooks Brothers is really popular here in the South. And then when I learned about Brooks Brothers and their connection to the slave trade, I'm thinking it makes complete sense. I mean, Brooks Brothers is overly popular in the South, just in terms of individuals who are in business, who are kind of a certain,
Hmm.
income level, who can afford it. It is a very popular men's clothing store. And so, companies could also contribute so that maybe it was less pressure on the federal government. And lastly, Jack, I would say the 11 to 14 trillion dollar price tag, which has come from people like Professor Sandy Darity, the intent of it is to raise the share of wealth in this country that Black people own from 3% to about 13%, which is the around the Black share of the US population. So the intent is to raise the wealth of Black Americans to at least what our percentage of the population is.
Okay.
So
Hmm.
that is the ultimate goal. Maybe it never happens because I'm in politics, Jack. So I understand this might
Yeah.
never happen. I mean,
Yeah.
it's maybe a 15 to 20% chance that it does, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't push for it.
And I guess what would be your case to, maybe like the white Americans who, as far, well, I'll just give this example, why, as far as I can tell, I have not had any ancestors who've owned slaves
Yeah.
or were even part of the slave trade. And the family I'm living with right now, they've had ancestors who were actively fighting against slavery at this time. And why, because of this, why should maybe like these people who've never been involved in in slavery in general pay?
Well, I would say, Jack, what I would say is this. One thing that you would actually, I wouldn't even say you'd be surprised with it because you probably see where I've gone with this in terms of people and claims that I think are valid. So when I just talked about Black immigrants, I said they deserve a claim. Mormons and other people who may have been dealt with serious injustice and brutality in the past deserve a claim. White Americans who live in Appalachia or anywhere in the country who are poor, dirt poor, and have been taken advantage of, they also do have a claim. What I would say is all claims have to be handled individually. And that's what surprises people is to say, I think there is a claim. So it's not to say that someone who is white and who has grown up with parents that are making 20 or 30,000 and they made 20 or 30,000, their kids made 20 or 30,000. I'm not saying that they haven't been screwed over either, because they have.
Hmm.
It's just every claim is handled separately. And I think that what I would say, Jack, too, is that it's kind of, I would just compare it to what the US government has agreed to do already. There are many Americans, white and Black, who did not intern Japanese Americans, but they were paid reparations and the bill was passed in the House and Senate and signed by President Ronald Reagan in the 80s to pay cash payments to Japanese Americans, which I agree that they should have gotten, and they did. So we have to make sure we take care of everyone. The next step has to be Black Americans, I think. But also I want to say that all these companies and other people who are stepping up and making statements and spending money and donating to Black Lives Matter, I think the money would be much more reasonably utilized if they just put money towards the reparations fund.
This concludes part one of my discussion with Alan. The views expressed on the Moderate Review are solely of the individuals participating and not necessarily of the organizations they are affiliated with. If you enjoy what you've heard, please leave a comment and tell your friends. Have you ever had a civil discussion with someone you disagreed with? If you have, what did you learn? Here on the Moderate Review, we try to have these kinds of discussions. So, let's talk. On this episode of the Moderate Review, I continue my discussion with Alan Holmes, and we pivot to Black Lives Matter and police brutality. So, let's talk.
I know we're going to talk about Black Lives Matter, and I, interestingly enough, don't think too highly of the national organization.
That's okay.
I
That's
I
quite an
I, I
okay.
think that I've never seen them in City Council District 9 where I work, Jack, where it's high poverty, a lot of suffering going on, but also a lot of gentrification, but a lot of just dire poverty and situations. I've never seen them hold any events. I've never seen them uplift the community. I've seen them protest and march, I've seen them get a lot of money from companies. We don't know where the money's going. So Black Lives Matter Black Lives Matter, the local groups, some of them are doing good things, and I've seen that. But the organization that you primarily and I primarily hear about online, they've enriched themselves, but I don't really know whether they're fully committed to uplifting the Black community because they don't really talk about reparations too much. You notice that?
Hmm.
They
Yeah.
talk about all these other things that aren't necessarily going to boost the economic position of Black people, but they just raise a lot of money. And
Mm.
I do not trust this organization, to be honest with you. The national organization, I don't trust them.
Yeah. So I guess I have a question about this because I've done some research on Black Lives Matter, not too much, but like maybe could you kind of clarify maybe the organization itself? Because I've kind of heard conflicting reports. There's like a national organization, but then like I've heard other reports where Black Lives Matter is kind of like not really a unified organization, but kind of more of like local chapters, kind of loosely tied together by
Yeah,
the idea.
so to my knowledge, Black Lives Matter, the national organization, I don't want to say funded, but I know that in the nonprofit space, when you're initially starting out, sometimes they go up under an established nonprofit that is heavily funded, right?
Hmm.
And the National Black Lives Matter organization is involved in a situation like that where now they're raising so much money that they almost may be self-sufficient, but they're an umbrella group of a more heavily funded nonprofit arm, and they again I'm not too convinced that they are truly in it for the betterment of Black America. They I don't agree with everything that they believe, and I think some Black people don't align with them, the national organization. Because again, I'm just one of these people, Jack. I treat everybody fairly, but I also need to see. I need to have witnessed you do some positive work to improve some people's lives, right?
Hmm.
I need to have seen you working in an impoverished community, doing something to have helped some people who need help, right? And if I've never seen you, what do you think I'm going to think? that
Mm.
that
Yeah.
you're because a lot of we have a lot of grifters out here now, Jack. We have a lot of nonprofits, and we see this in Atlanta that get millions in funding. We don't know where the money goes. We know that these people that work for the nonprofits are well compensated as far as their yearly salary, but we never see anything actually improve. And so that is my suspicion about the Black Lives Matter national organization. I just think they're celebrities, and they really are not in this space to create the real change. They're positioned to profit from it. Well, you've seen how much they've brought in over the last 2 years. But are they really committed to the improvement of the marginalized communities? I'm still
Mm.
not convinced on that.
Okay. And I guess two follow-up questions with it. And if you're uncomfortable sharing, that's fine. But like, what is it particular that you don't agree with Black Lives Matter, and also what would it take for you to throw your support towards Black Lives Matter?
So I would say that my biggest issue, and I'm almost just like upset. Not, I won't say obsessed with it, but I think that it is just has to be the number one priority is pushing for reparations. Black Lives Matter has the funding and the social media presence to do so. They do not. And that's my biggest issue with them is everything they're pushing is very all focus needs to be on reparations. And if it's not, then that strikes me as the same strategy that a lot of these other organizations who have failed pursue, which is which is programs, which is beliefs that don't translate to any economic improvement in our communities, and no focus on data and numbers and just acknowledging how bad things are. That is my biggest issue with them, is that that is not their priority. And so if they all of a sudden switch and they become as strong of advocates for reparations as I am, then I'll consider changing my mind, Jack, on them. But currently, they don't seem to be focused on that. And so, again, a lot of these nonprofits, and me being in politics, I've seen it here in the city of Atlanta, is, if you're a nonprofit and you position yourself to not really be pushing the bold change, but kind of just you can create some sort of entity that has programs and resources that really do nothing. But if you market yourself well, you can obtain quite a bit of funding. And if you created the nonprofit or you're a staffer, you're good, right? And you can financially, the businesses can dump money into your nonprofit, and really nothing is changing, but you guys are holding programs and initiatives and doing everything. That is the model that I've seen play out too often. And that is my suspicion about where the Black Lives Matter national organization is headed, to just be an organization that throws a bunch of Zoom events, does a lot of video marketing campaigns, dumps a lot of money into digital, but really is not pushing for things like reparations that are a little bit bold. That is never open to doing that. So as they get in more corporate money, I think they'll simply continue down the path that they're on. So I think that's my biggest issue with Black Lives Matter, the national org. But I would emphasize that the local organizations, some of them have done some excellent work, food drives, passing out masks, doing street cleanups, just being positive members of the community. And a lot of the local organizations, Jack, do not align with the national organization.
Yeah, that
So
is
I
quite
think,
interesting.
I think there needs to be a distinction about, that part of it. Because I think that even where you're at in Salt Lake City in Utah, the Black Lives Matter Salt Lake City, if they have one, they might be doing a lot of work that you might agree with. But then what you're seeing on LinkedIn and Twitter and Instagram is mainly, it could be the Black Lives Matter national organization. So I think we just also always have to kind of understand that distinction.
Yeah. And I guess maybe just adding this too, but I think, going back to what you've been saying, I think a lot of people do agree with the idea, that Black lives do matter, but like more of like these, like you're saying, these local organizations kind of are advocating for like, Marxist policies or even defunding the police, which I think a lot of people are not fond of. And, and I think that's why most people are very hesitant with, throwing support with Black Lives Matter. They agree with the idea, but not really the organization.
Yeah, and here's the deal. I think that what I would encourage people to do is this. I would encourage people to simply support a group that's pushing for reparations. There's a lot. I mean, again, there's people like you just described who might support reparations. They might really have a problem with what's going on in this country. But again, they don't agree with everything for Black Lives Matter. So my point is, I don't have an issue with them not agreeing. I'm saying that there's other organizations who are focused mainly just on reparations and aren't even touching some of those topics that you just brought up. And what I would say, Jack, is I've seen it as far as the defund the police movement. My thoughts on it are this: because police brutality was ignored for so long, I see how we got here.
Mm.
I can't say I agree with everything regarding it, but I would say that we have to acknowledge, and everybody in the country needs to acknowledge, that if we had just all of a sudden woken up after Rodney King was beaten and just said, we're going to stop this, right? Cities instituted policies, police union contracts were tightened up and revised. Maybe we wouldn't be here, because nobody was talking about, you remember, Jack, nobody was talking about defunding police 7 years ago, 8 years ago, 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
But then nothing happened. People got killed. Nothing happened. People got killed on TV. Nothing happened. So I don't agree with every approach of defunding police. But I also understand why people are advocating for it. Now, with that said, I'll say that my biggest things with criminal justice from working in city council was these two things that I think we need to do. I'm not saying defund anything. I'm saying what we need to focus on are ending qualified immunity, if possible, in your state, so that officers can personally be charged for, personally be held liable in civil suits.
Okay, that's
Cities
fair.
no longer need to pay the liability insurance for rogue police officers, but they need to continue to pay liability insurance policies for the good officers, which there are many. The issue is there's no financial pain for an officer who commits police brutality. If the pain financially increases, the brutality will decrease, I promise you. I mean, think about, Jack, think about plastic surgeons, right?
Mm.
Doctors.
Yeah.
We don't pay their liability insurance, they pay it.
Mm-hmm.
When they mess up, they're on the line, right? And actually, they're probably more careful than they would be if we paid it.
Yeah. And I
So,
think. Yeah. Go
yes.
ahead.
No, I was just saying, I think we need to think of it that way. Is the irony of this all, and what we're talking about, the unrest in this country and George Floyd, is that in Minneapolis, some activists and Minneapolis residents actually, before the George Floyd murder even happened, were able to successfully get a referendum on the ballot in Minneapolis on the municipal level to say that the city of Minneapolis would no longer pay the liability insurance of officers who committed police brutality, but they would maintain the insurance for the good officers. It passed, but it was either the Minnesota Supreme Court or the Minnesota legislature shot it down. I think it was the Minnesota Supreme Court shot it down because they said it violated state law, which says that municipal employees or government employees must be represented in a manner in which the municipality pays for it if they're in the process of their job duties.
Mm.
So you see, so that's the second thing that needs to change. That needs to end. No more liability insurance being paid for problematic officers. They're going to pay their own, and every time they have an infraction, it's going to increase, which will eventually wash them out the force because they can't afford it. And then thirdly, police union contracts need to be drastically revised. Police union contracts dictate what happens to an officer when infractions occur. They actually dictate all the workings of a police department. Drug testing, life insurance, pension, everything is in a police union contract. And a lot of police union contracts are very lax, right? They give the officers too much leeway. This is the reason that you've seen some officers kill someone or brutally beat someone
Mm-hmm.
be found not guilty by the DA in the court, and then the city has to hire them back and pay them back pay. That's in the police union contract. So so those are the three things that I think need to be worked on, Jack. So I don't say defund the police. I say let's work on those three things and then let's see what happens. Because what I've told people who believe in defunding the police is that, okay, I'm not telling you how to believe what to believe,
Hmm.
but I'm telling you that in our district, in my district, which is a majority Black district, right? Nobody's really wanting to defund the police. I get more phone calls than I did after Rayshard Brooks and George Floyd were killed about, can you call the police here? Can the police come here? Can the police come there? I've had to diffuse situations and fix situations that didn't involve the police, but the people called in our city council office and asked that I send the police. So you see,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
this was after George Floyd. So what I'm saying is the number of people in an actual city like Atlanta, the city limits, who support defund the police is small. You hear a lot of it online, but that doesn't translate offline.
Yeah. Hmm.
So what I would tell the people who want to defund the police is, I'm not saying I'm supportive of whatever somebody can get done politically. So I tell people, if you want to defund the police, well, then you better get enough people who want that to happen in this city council district or that one and organize. If you can actually get that to happen, then it'll happen. But right now, the reality is the majority of the people who vote or who call in the office that I work for are not calling for defunding anything. So I think the online marketing, the online advocacy, the things that you see every day, Jack, and I see, sometimes it gives people the impression that that same thing is happening offline, and it's not. I'm telling you, because I work in politics, it's not. There's not a bunch of people calling my office every day saying we want the police defunded. And ironically, when the city council of Atlanta had to decide on whether they wanted to defund the police, do you know that the city council meetings are Monday? So on Sunday, when I checked the voicemail, because we're working remotely, there were like 60 voicemails, which is insane, right? I listened to every one of them because I respect the callers. And 58 of them that called were talking about defund the police. Do you know how many of them lived in the district that I work in?
Not very much, I'm guessing.
Two, which means, and I appreciate the people for actually saying where they were from when they call, which you should do that because I'm actually making a tally of it as I go through the voicemail. So which that means a majority of residents in the district I work in did not support it, but people from all over the country were just calling because they support it, and I respect that they support it. It did not pass. So I think that it's really, Jack, another thing is just that some of the people that want to defund the police, they're spending more time online than they are offline, actually building the amount of residents in each of these cities who even support it. So they've got to do so much legwork that it's unimaginable to build that power. And it's not, I haven't seen it yet.
All right. Kind of we're on the same vein, a little bit more about defending the police and police brutality. And much of what you said, I think a lot of people can get behind. And I will say, well, I guess maybe this is probably more the controversial statements I'll say is I feel like with the media, I feel like they treat every whenever a police officer kills or kills a black man or a minority, that they treat it as like Rodney King, which I'm of the opinion, yeah, stuff like that happens, but I'm not sure every single time, every single instance like this happens. And I actually watched the video of George Floyd being arrested, and I'm actually kind of leaning more on the side of the officers, where like, well, even when they were putting him in handcuffs and trying to put him in the car, like long before he was like on the ground with their knees on his necks, he was saying, "I can't breathe, I can't breathe." What are your thoughts on that?
So I think that, every issue is different, Jack. I think I mean, there's some issues where, there's some issues where deadly force is just going to have to happen.
Mhm.
But I think that with George Floyd, Derek Chauvin should have never got to that point. I think with Derek Chauvin, the officer in the George Floyd murder, he should have never been on the force. Now let's understand the policy I just told you that was passed, the amendment, or excuse me, well, the I guess I would call it a it was an amendment to the code of the city of Minneapolis that passed. Derek Chauvin probably would have never still been on the force had it passed because he had what 14 to 16 incidents. He would have been the exact officer that his liability insurance would have been $2,000 a month. A cop can't afford that. So I think there's so many things that happened, I think, in that situation, even leading up to it, that shouldn't have happened. And I think that we have to understand that policing needs to just be completely reimagined. I guess that's the branded word, right? But to think in the George Floyd incident, Jack, of the fact that as the officer had his knee on him and people were recording, the other officers are just standing there. And the fact that nobody thought, well, he might die, that proves that the policing in America is just like, I don't even know where we go from here. And I mean, defund, reimagine, whatever you want to call it, it's a serious problem, and it's expensive, Jack. It's expensive when you look at the lawsuit. So did you know that the Marshall Project, they did a study. They found that 31 large US cities spent $3 billion on police misconduct over the last 10 years. Um, and when it comes to police brutality bonds, because in a crazy twist, Wall Street has found a way to profit on for this. Which, hey, they find ways. It is what it is.
Yeah.
I mean, this is just
Yeah.
it tells you
Yeah.
the problem. So in 2018, the ACRE Action Center found that cities and counties borrowed a total of 878 million in bonds to cover police related settlements and judgments. Chicago was number one. They took out $709.3 million in bonds in 2018 to pay for police misconduct lawsuits that the general fund couldn't cover. So it is it I don't even know what to do. I mean, and well, I'm not even blaming Wall Street, to be honest with you. I mean, because to be honest with you, if everything I brought up as three solutions had been implemented years ago, we wouldn't be having this conversation.
Mm.
Until the liability insurance issue is tweaked and until the qualified immunity is tweaked, it's going to keep happening because the officers know that the city is responsible.
Mm.
Taxpayers cover it. I mean, it would be like if Americans, if our law in America stated that you don't receive points on your license or pay money for speeding tickets. Do you think people will stop speeding?
Oh, no, they wouldn't. They'd probably go faster. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think we have to address it because the road we're going down and the amount of money cities have spent is obscene. So the next time you're driving in Salt Lake City and you hit a pothole and you call your city councilman upset, just think that some of that money they pay out in police brutality lawsuits could have went to the potholes you need fixed on your street. So we need to. I mean, there is a true cost to this because taxpayers who call city council members in the city about things that legitimately are problems have to realize that money goes to other things that they shouldn't.
Hmm.
So then they can't be ready for your issue. They may not be available for your legitimate issue. So if we fix the police brutality, we have more money to pay for other things.
All right. That is interesting. And, I will say this as well, when these riots were happening, back in after not Rodney King, George Floyd,
Yeah.
I literally, I will agree. I do think something does need to change. I mean, literally, if people are willing to protest about this, and I don't think, like, going back to this, I don't think every police officer is, hell bent on killing minorities. I don't think that's the case, but I definitely do think that we definitely should be looking into how we police, and I definitely do think, making the changes that you're suggesting, maybe getting rid of qualified immunity, maybe breaking I guess, the union's hold over the police forces. I can get behind on that.
Yeah, and you know what, Jack? The thing about it is, I don't even blame the police unions. It is the mayors and many of the city council members of the city that again have to agree to the terms of the contract. Now, the union has to agree, but you got to think about it. Think about think about the states that you can think in your head where right to work states, states that aren't necessarily pro union. There's some pro union states, obviously, but there's many anti union states. So the funny thing about this is that states that are anti union, when it comes to the cops, though, they're very pro. When it comes to anything else, they're anti-union, any other union, right? So I mean, in states that are anti-union, the cities can and counties can most certainly come down harder and be more aggressive in the negotiation phase. So that's why it's like there's many. Even Georgia's one, for example. Georgia's a right to work state. I guess Utah may be as well, but
It is, yeah.
yes, so like this is not a union state, but yet the police unions get whatever they want. So it comes down to the elected officials and trying to get the political change regarding getting some more city council members or mayors in place that are willing to get tough when it comes to renegotiating the police union contract. So that's what would change this whole dynamic. And again, it all comes down to the elected officials, Jack. I mean, who's in place and who is willing to be bold. That's what it'll come down to.
Before we close up this interview, if people want to learn more about you and what you do, what is the best way to reach you at?
You know, I am on Twitter heavily. My Twitter handle is Holmes, OH_HOLMES. I guess I will leave the information to my podcast, so anyone who wants to follow can always go to YPay. That is the name of the podcast, and you can find it on all streaming platforms. So it's just called YPay.
This concludes part 2 of my discussion with Alan Holmes. The views expressed on the Moderate Review are solely of the individuals participating and not necessarily of the organizations they are affiliated with. If you enjoy what you've heard, please leave a comment and tell your friends.